In C-style languages, an object that hasn't been initialized is said to be null. That is, it doesn't reference anything in memory. In Visual Basic, you can check for the null state with the keyword nothing. So when working with complex objects, this sort of code is pretty common. I'm working a project named null operator, and I'll open the code behind file for the main Windows XAML file, and I'll add code to the run code subroutine. First, I'll declare a variable that I'll call string var. I'll set its type as string, and I'll give it an initial value of hello. Next, I'll use a conditional block. I'll start off with an if statement, and I'll set the condition to string var is not nothing. And then, if that condition is true, I'll declare another variable that I'll call strLength. I'll set its type as integer, and I'll give it a value of string var.length. And then I'll use my output subroutine, and I'll start with a literal of length equals, and then I'll append to that strLength.toString. Then I'll run the code without debugging. I'll click the Go button, and there's the result. As expected, the length is 5. That is, 5 characters in the string. Now, this sort of conditional check can become cumbersome. In the most recent version of Visual Basic, though, a new operator was introduced called the null propagating operator. It's the question mark character, and it lets you short-circuit the evaluation. Instead of having to check for nothing every time, you can instead accept the default string representation of null or nothing, which is an empty string. Here's how it could work. First of all, I'm going to comment out my conditional statements. I'll press Ctrl-K, Ctrl-C first on the if statement, and then I'll do the same thing on the end if. Then I'll change my declaration of the string var variable from hello to nothing, and I'll comment out the rest of the line with the apostrophe. So now, when I try to run the code, I'm going to get an exception, because string var is nothing, or null, and I'm trying to evaluate one of its properties. I'll choose Debug, Start Without Debugging. I'll click Go, and I get an expected exception. I'll select the appropriate debugger, and I get the information null reference exception was unhandled. So I'll stop debugging, and then I'll fix the code like this. First of all, I'll add a question mark after the reference to the object that might be null or nothing. And then, because I'm going to be returning a nothing value from that expression, I'll also set the data type as a nullable value as well. I'll add a question mark after the data type of integer. And I'll run the code again. And this time when I click Go, I get length equals, but nothing afterward. And again, the reason you don't get anything is because the result of that evaluation is that it returns the string equivalent of nothing, which is an empty string. There are still going to be times when you need to explicitly check for null. But a very simple way of doing that is using the if condition, which looks like this. I'll start with a call to my output function, and then I'll pass in length equals, and then I'll append the following expression. I'll start with if, and then a pair of parentheses. And this is a 3-part expression. First, I'll use the expression strLength is nothing. And then the first value that I'll output will be the value I want if that expression is true, and the second will be the value if it's false, and that'll once again be strLength.toString. And I'll run the code again, and this time I get length equals 0 for the second output. So if you need to evaluate the condition, you can do it easily with the if function, but if you need to simply default to an empty string, you can do that very simply with the new null propagating operator, the question mark.